Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for accepting our invitation to be here today. We're all here because Canadians are frustrated. They're angry, they're dismayed, and they feel betrayed. Both in the travel period of last summer and in the most recent holiday travel period, we saw the big airlines walk all over any semblance of passenger rights in this country. We now have a backlog of 33,000 complaints before the CTA, and that's just the tip of the iceberg because we know that only a small fraction of passengers manage to jump through all the hoops that you've created for them and get to the complaint process. Now, the big airlines are acting this way because they can get away with it, because you let them. And my first question for you is, why have you not stood up to the airlines on behalf of air passengers?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Bachrach, I appreciate your question, and I am here also equally because I know Canadians are frustrated, and I am frustrated, and I believe that this committee here is able to provide information and answers for Canadians and keep the pressure on the sector, including on government, to make sure that we do everything we can to protect passengers' rights. Let's be clear. The responsibility is of the airlines to uphold passengers' rights. Airlines, when they violate the rules, they need to be held accountable for that. They need to compensate their passengers. They need to compensate their customers for what they paid them to do. And we need to avoid, in fact, going to the CTA for passengers to receive the compensation they deserve. We've set up a framework that never existed in Canada's history before 2019 because we saw the vacuum that existed. 2019 rules came into in force before the pandemic. The pandemic exposed certain area weaknesses. We strengthened them, and now we are looking at additional ways to strengthen the rules. So let's be clear. The airlines should or must continue to uphold passengers' rights, and when they violate them, they need to compensate their customers.
Well, Minister, I would argue that it's also the government's responsibility to uphold passenger rights, and unfortunately, the air passenger protection regime that you've created has massive loopholes in it. You could fly a 747 through these things, and we see airlines clearly exploiting those loopholes in order to avoid paying passengers the compensation that they're due. So it is positive to hear that you're once again going to go into the protection regulations and make some changes. My question is whether you'll commit to this committee that when those changes are done, Canada's legislation and regulations will be up to the standards set by the European Union and considered the gold standard for air passenger protection around the world.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Bachrach, I know this committee held hearings in November on the Passenger Bill of Rights. And now you know you've had expert witnesses tell you that the regime is quite strong. I know you've had experts tell you that it was stronger, much stronger than the U.S. regime. I know there are differences between our system and the European system, and we're looking, and we have been looking, and we'll continue to look at other jurisdictions around the world. So I commit to you that we are learning from the lessons of the last year, and that we are committed to clarifying, strengthening, and simplifying rules. So that is my commitment to you and to Canadians. But let there be no confusion. It is our government who understood that there is a vacuum there, that we brought in the Bill of Rights, that we studied and implemented rights that are way stronger than exist in our neighbors to the south. And any responsible government would learn and look for more opportunities to strengthen these rules, and that's precisely what we're doing.
You said earlier that you haven't directed the CTA because of its arm's length quasi-judicial nature, and yet the Canada Transportation Act specifically sets out in Section 43 the power for you to provide policy direction to the CTA. Why have you never used that tool despite all the challenges that we've seen in this country?
Actually, that's not true, Mr. Bachrach. I have directed the CTA on several policy items. The question is directing them on an investigation. But on a policy perspective, I'll tell you, I'll have in my mind the recent example. I've sent a directive to the CTA about accessibility, about making sure that airlines and the sector has strong rules to accommodate their customers who have accessibility issues. So I have utilized that tool on bilingualism. We will continue to use, but the question was on specific investigation, which is different than
no,
policy.
It wasn't on a specific investigation. It was on the topic of air passenger rights. For instance, the fact that the CTA has utterly failed to penalize the airlines at monetary amounts that are meaningful. The only fines we've seen total a little over $100,000. In the United States, the government has fined the big airlines over $7 million since the beginning of the pandemic. Why does this government treat the airlines with kid gloves, and why haven't you provided direction to the CTA to strengthen enforcement so that the airlines stop trampling on air passenger rights?
Mr. Bachrach, I appreciate your passion on this, and I share it. You had airlines today and on previous occasions tell you how this government is not treating them with kids' gloves. We are not treating airlines with kids' gloves. In fact, we're looking to, as I said, further strengthen the rules to ensure that passengers are protected. So let's be very clear. We have provided the CTA with the regulatory framework to uphold the law, to fine airlines who have been found in violation. And are there opportunities to strengthen these rules? I'm saying yes, and we're working on them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, you said one of the areas you're looking at is strengthening the fines that are possible under the Air Passenger Protection Regulations and the Canadian Transportation Act. But right now, there are fines of up to $25,000 per passenger that are possible under existing legislation. And yet, the only time we've seen the CTA issue airlines fines under the APPR, we saw fines of about $200 per passenger. Why didn't you use your ability under the Canadian Transportation Act to order the CTA to increase its fines and strengthen its enforcement to act as a deterrent? Like $200 isn't enough. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that.
Mr. Bachrach, you just acknowledged that the CTA has the authority to impose a fine up to $25,000 per passenger. The CTA has that authority. Please forgive me for avoiding to look like I am interfering into the independence of the CTA. My expectation is that the rules are enforced and that passengers' rights are upheld. I know that the CTA is coming here, so I'm sure that would be an interesting question for the CTA.
So, Minister, when you have companies worth hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, what is the purpose of a $200 fine per passenger? What's the goal of these administrative monetary penalties? Because it seems comical, frankly.
Mr. Bachrach, I'll repeat. We provided the CTA with authorities to impose significant fines. We leave the discretion to a quasi-judicial independent body to decide, based on the facts before them, what type of fines they impose. I think the CTA is capable of explaining how they come up with their decision. However, the government has provided authority to the CTA to impose significant fines, and as I just said, we are looking at whether there's an opportunity to increase those fines.
Will you commit to amending the legislation that APPR is built on, not simply changing the regulations themselves?
As we are in the process of examining how we strengthen the rules, if part of that strengthening the rules requires legislative changes, then yes, we will make the necessary legislative changes.
Will you commit to closing the loophole in the Canadian Transportation Act, Section 8611?
Mr. Bachrach, as I've been spending the hour here telling you, we're looking to strengthen the rules and learn from lessons of the past. And the commitment that I have to all of you is not only that I am pursuing those, but I'll take your input into consideration as we are examining what additional tools to introduce.
I'll be happy to provide it. My last question, when you spoke with Sunwing, did you encourage them to proactively pay customers the compensation they are due under the air passenger protection regulations instead of filing a complaint and standing in line for 18 months to get a ruling from the CTA?
Yes. In fact, the president of Sunwing Airline promised that that's what they're doing.
That they are going to proactively award compensation.
Mr. Bachrach.
That they are
Thank you.